So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Neil Ward. I'm one of the Pro-Vice Chancellors here at UEA, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's inaugural lecture. I'm delighted to be introducing Dabo Guan, Professor of Climate Change Economics. Dabo has worked at UEA's School of International Development since October 2014. Alongside his position as an academic researcher here, he's also a senior member of St Edmund's College at the University of Cambridge and a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in China. Dabo specialises in environmental economics for international climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. He conducts scenario analysis on the environmental impacts of climate change and the management of water resources and explores the applications of this in both developed and developing countries. He's the author of over 70 publications, including articles published in Science and Nature magazines, and has gained extensive media coverage for his research into climate change and China's carbon emissions. Dabo is a lead author for the 5th assessment report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he's been awarded numerous academic prizes for his contributions to climate change economics, including the PNAS Cozzarelli Prize in 2014 and a Philip Leverhulme Prize. Before taking up his current position here at the University of East Anglia, Dabo was a senior lecturer at the University of Leeds for 3 years, as well as a senior research associate at the Cambridge Centre for Climate Change Mitigation Research, and a research associate at the University of Cambridge's Judge Business School. Prior to this, he worked for the Worldwide Fund for Nature as an economist. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to visitors to UEA this evening, and I will now ask Professor Dabo Guan to present his inaugural lecture.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dabo Guan. I'm a native Chinese, and I work in the UK study and work in the UK for almost 16 years. So I'm very glad to be here tonight and to present, to summarize the work I've been doing over the last decade almost, and working on the climate change and the international trade. My background is trained as an economist, but not a mainstream economist to saving the banks or saving us from the financial crisis. I'm trying to look at the environmental side of the work, and by using trade as a storyline to talk about the story. Perhaps let me get started on my lecture here. We're gonna talk about climate change policy, and I assume people has some background about climate change and the global warming. I try to use not so much jargons, and I try to use the lay language to explain what we have been achieved over the last few years, mainly using China as a key focus to carry out the story. I'm working as an economist. The main task is trying to conduct performance assessment for the climate change policy. So really, there's a number of climate policy. I really want to know whether those policies are effective, or is a success, or is not really successful. Let me just give you some of the summary of the milestone of climate policies achieved over the last couple of decades. Firstly, there's 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention. They make one of the agreement, which is I highlight here, avoided the dangerous human-induced climate change, and later on translated as not exceeding 2 degrees C in the Bali, in 2012, I think. But in 1992, the scientists and the politicians made agreement that we try to limit the temperature rising to avoid the global warming. And in 1997, it's a very, very important year of the climate change, because 192 countries, the leaders or the president or the chairman, they gather in the Kyoto in Japan to sign this famous Kyoto Protocol. There are two objectives in the list in the Kyoto Protocol, but people often forget the second one. But nevertheless, let's review the first one is reduce GHG emission, which is greenhouse gas emissions in NXP country, which is developed countries, 5% below 1990s level. And don't forget, actually, there's a second objective. This says help non-NXP countries, which is developing countries, to tackle GHG emissions. So really, what's the progress has been to date, and what's the best way forward? We're just trying to do it together. Let's see how it goes. This is a figure shows emission growth between 1990s, CO2 emission growth between 1990 and 2010 in 20 years' time. So I divide this figure into two periods. So before 2000, the globally emission growth at 1% per year. After we have the Kyoto Protocol and other climate change policy, emission growth by 3.4%. So it literally tripled the growth. So whether the climate policy is a good thing or not, it's, this is what I'm asking. Why, we are trying to upgrade to limit the emission growth, and suddenly, once we sign this is emission growth tripled. If you care, the climate change negotiations, this year is one for the big year, and possibly in 20 days, 25 days, all the leaders will gather in Paris. They're going to sign another. Hopefully, they're going to sign another climate change agreement. What we usually refer to right now is a post-Kyoto climate change policy. So if after Paris, are we going to see a 9% growth after this? So if the climate policy is so bad, whether we need it or not, why this is people, it's so fascinating to get people signing agreements like that, if we know the policy is not good. And we are trying to go behind this trend, see what's going on, why it's like that. Related to the Kyoto Protocol, there's two objectives, as I said. The first one is, we are doing pretty good. The first one was the help the developed countries, and NXP countries, they're going to achieve 5% reduction below 1990s level. So the black line here, it's fine. Although United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, some of the developed countries, during the Kyoto Protocol implementation period, they pull out from the agreement, but because of their contribution from Europe, and also thanks to the financial crisis we have currently, the emissions pretty much stabilized and actually achieved over 5% growth for the developed country as a whole. But the problem, don't forget, we had a second objective in the Kyoto Protocol saying that help developing countries to limit their growth. But we are really not doing a good job. In 2004, 2005, the developing country as a whole take over the developed countries, become the largest emitter in the world, and mainly contributed, say, China, some by India, but mainly China. We talk so much about emissions and growth. Really, how we count for the emissions. I'm trying to give some of the ideas. How do we count emission in the world, and what emission accounting methodology and the international or the politicians using for negotiations. If we summarize this, it's actually two big categories. One is focus on production-based emissions. The other focus on consumption-based. But within the production-based, there's two type of, well, not say two types. One is the less incomplete, what we call territorial emission accounting, which all the countries are using right now, including Kyoto Protocol. Also, Paris is gonna using this methodology to do this. So, what are they? So, territory emission accountings. Really, if we have two countries, like country A as China, let's say United States, and the country B is China. So whoever, whatever the factories or emission coming in the United States is United States emissions. And whatever emitted in the territory of Chinese boundaries, that's Chinese emissions. But what are the missing ones? So the linkage between that is missing. So there's aviation, international aviation, and the international shipping are missing. Why they are missing? Why we don't do it just allocate it? Because when they set up this territory emission accounting framework in 1990s, at that time, the aviation and international shipping is very small in terms of GHG emissions. They were less than 0.5% of the global total at that time. But now, because of the trade, because you guys go to holidays, it's increasing so much. I don't have a latest figure, but by 2012, the international shipping and aviation account for 15%, 1/5, 15% of global total already. But still, the politicians hasn't been able to use, allocate this. That purely because it's quite difficult. Because you have a British Airways fly from Heathrow to New York, and they possibly mix between British and Americans. Possibly there's a few Chinese like me and Mexicans, etc. But whose emission it is? So it's how do you allocate these things? It's complicated. And similarly for the shippings, you send your parcels to the U.S. or to China by like a Korean ferry, and whose responsibilities? Later on, the EU researchers proposed this what they called production-based emission accounting framework, which allocates this emission, international shipping emissions based on this production basic framework. But they're saying that if there's a US here and this is China, and the link, like say the flight or the aviation between them, it doesn't really matter it's a British Airways or there's this Air China or there's this a Qantas or it doesn't really matter. Whoever, if it depart from Heathrow is a British airport, that's just a UK emission. The logic behind that is you need fueling the aircraft, so that the petroleum or the air, the fuels is produced or is here. So therefore, it doesn't matter how many British is sitting on the British Airways or Air China, whatever the flight is, and it's just your emission is. And similarly, if there's an aircraft fly from Beijing to Heathrow, that is Chinese emissions. It's simple like that. Otherwise, there's no way you can allocate it. Become very complicated. And the little things about international tourism. So if you as a British visit the Chinese cities, and your consumptions there and your emissions there still counts for British emissions. So, but they are slightly. It's still quite small right now. And but due to the globalization, that possibly will increase significantly. So by definition, if you are they defined by nationalities. If you are British, and although you are in China, but it's still Britain emissions. This is basic from production perspective. Really, who emit, who take the responsibility. But the other type of emission accounting framework, what we call consumption-based. So we got, United States here, and we got China. United States imports large amounts of goods from China. Is it fair to put those emissions to Chinese people? Similarly, Chinese China, they got imports from, from US as well. So is this fair for the US citizens to take the Chinese consumptions? So really, so from consumption perspective, is that whatever you produced minus whatever you export plus whatever you import. So this is the basic rationale behind this. So so really, it's the territorial producer emission accounting approach tells you where the emission happened. And it happened in the US, happened in the UK. But the consumption emission accounting tells you why the emission happened. So, but there's two different approach. Which one is more fair? And whose responsibility? When it comes to the policy discussions or negotiations, it always comes, China is the world manufacturer that produce so much. I'm pretty sure right now, possibly 5 years ago, almost everything you wear is made in China, maybe 90%. And now possibly down to the ratio down to 50 or 40%. But still, half of what you are wearing right now, including glasses, the scarves, the laptops you're using, possibly large amounts is made in China. Is this fair for the emission to produce those things, and you are benefiting is that it should take the Chinese people should take that. I'll give you another example, not about emission, but toys. So on the left-hand side is where the toy produced. The world toy production, you can see that mostly is produced here, which is the East, China and then South Asia countries produce. But on the other hand, the same coin, but the different side, it's world consumption. The toy consumption is largely consumed by us in the Europe and the US. And Italy, it's actually the world largest per capita wise for the toy consumptions. And many grandparents buy the toys for their grandchildren. And Italy is especially the case. And okay, so really it's whose responsibility? If we talk about the toy, if the toy too toxic or to consume so much resources, and whose responsibility to take the reduction? Division of labor, because of the even small things, another example for the toothbrush, even a small toothbrush, the electronic one, it's require multiple, a dozen of countries co-produce these products. And how do we count those emissions? How do we gonna relocate those things, and how we are gonna really talk about responsibility for reducing the emissions for producing toothbrush. Toothbrush is just an example, but anything even more complicated is even more locations you're gonna involved in terms of producing this. We have spent some effort to allocate the emissions, the CO2 emissions, from production perspective to consumption perspective as the two things we said. Because they are eventually it's just the same thing, but you can see the sector changes over the allocation process. From production perspective, power plants, electricity generations is always the biggest user or biggest contributor to the CO2 emissions, the yellow one. But nobody eats electricity. You are using for lightings, a little bit for charging your phones, but large amounts of the electricity is using for processing steel, processing metals, and produce cements, etc. And so the electricity mainly, disappeared during the allocation process. Become the construction sector becomes the largest contributor from consumption perspective. If you think about the construction sector, the supply chain of the construction sector, what do they need? To fulfill the construction demand, you will need cement, you need metal, you need steel, you need glass, you need bricks, And all those things, when you're producing those things, you need you will produce lots of emissions, or you burn lots of fossil fuels. Similarly, machinery, heavy machineries, etc., they are the major contributors to the climate change from the consumption perspective. Okay, so that's basically some of the method. We basically give you some introduction about the method. Next, I'm gonna talk the case for China, and we are gonna use the method I'm just saying, and to flesh out some of the ideas or the stories I'm going to say. So I'm proud of being a Chinese because we make miracles, and we love miracles. Right now, there's Chinese economic development has been slowed down a little bit, but there's I think it's a tradition for all Asian countries, because the Indians making double-digit growth, and they saying they are gonna make another miracle, so they're gonna take over China to become the largest economy. So it's really in the next few years, if that happens, it's really a miracle, basically. So just summarize, the economic growth by using a different from the people's lifestyle perspective. So over the last, say, 30 years, since China really opened up for the international world, like the end of 1970s, like early of 1980s, Chinese economy, the Chinese people has experiencing from poverty to enough food and clothes. And a large share of the Chinese achieve well-being lifestyles. Chinese economic structure has been shifting from agriculture-based economy to very much industry-based. Most of the provinces in the industry-based, and more service sector playing an important part in their economy. Education side, we're in the UEA, one of the education sector. We are experiencing from a poor education, which is, people cannot afford to go to schools. And 99% of the China achieve 9 years of free schooling systems. And now China is the largest PhD producer in the world, and they are having a debate whether we need so much PhDs rather than electricians or plumbers. And there's like a relatively low skill of the labor-intensive workers has been shrink very much. And then now you find a plumber or electrician in Beijing or in Shanghai, it has similar price. You find it here in the UK, at least in Norwich, not to London. So whether we need so much PhDs. We make world number one. We love to make world number ones. We have the high-speed rail, 430 kilometers per hour. The MagNav connect you from Shanghai Airport, Pudong Airport to the city center by 7 minutes, and which is 35 kilometers, I think. And we just talk about how slow my friend came from Cambridge to Norwich. So I had a statistics basically from Peterborough to Norwich is one of the slowest train in the world almost. So it's pretty much similar to 1930s level when we first have a railway network in the UK. So it hasn't been improved that much. And we have the world largest wastewater treatment plants and a word mile. And also we learned from Britain about the roundabout system. We have the world's largest roundabouts in the world, but it caused the worst congestions in China. I'm not mentioning the city there. And the reason that you can see that we learned the infrastructure, not the mechanisms. So people don't really know or don't obey the mechanism of the roundabout. You can't really have 5 lines on the roundabout that will just kill the mechanisms. Anyway, so that's the Chinese economic growth. But there's resources behind the supporting the growth. And so we trying to look at the emission, trying to do several tests. So the emission growth in China over 1980s to 2002, so about 20 years time, the CO2 emission grows about twice, it's 200%. The orange line is the CO2 emissions growth for China over 20 years. And we decompose, so we separate this CO2 emission growth by different socio-economic factors. So I'm not including populations, including economic structure change, etc. But there are two major drivers here. The blue one is the per capita GDP growth, which is the consumption needs, the per capita consumption requirement. And the red one is the technology gains. So basically, to control the CO2 emission growth, there's two major drivers. It becomes a race between your demand and technology. So the government always think, okay, technology is so powerful, let's rely on technology. So we are trying to, over the next few slides, I'm going to show you whether there's a race between GDP growth and technology. Who is going to win in the future is a very much a policy question. If the technology wins, we shouldn't worry about GDP growth. We shouldn't just let the technology do the work that most of us do, right? We just rely on the technology. We always trust them. But whether they can win the game in the future. And soon later, in the next 5 years, and we revisit the data and have some new data comes in. So we do this test again. So the CO2 intensity, which is technology, offsetting a lot of the CO2 emissions. But on the other hand, GDP growth, and they are still, racing with each other. But there's another driver comes in, the production structure. During that 2002, I'll give you some background there. In 2002, China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization. China started to become the world manufacturers in the world. So thanks to you to order so much, the benefits from the cheap products from China, the Chinese economic structure suddenly shift to a lot of cheap but emission intensive productions. So the economic structure changed, and they actually joined the game in terms of the racing game to whether it's offsetting or it's increases CO2 emissions. And if you look at the who is contributing this from a consumption perspective, over the last 27 years, the capital investment, which is mostly construction sectors, capital investment, you can see China building a high-speed rail, they are building airports, they're building motorways, etc. So the capital investment is the largest driver for Chinese emission growth. But in exports is playing an important role in driving Chinese emission growth. Chinese export, basically, to the UK, to the US, etc. So our imports. And then we you see where the emission goes, or where the exports goes. So we did some of the work trying to aggregate the world all the countries into 10 regions, 10 world regions. But the first one we called East Asia, but mainly 95% is China here. So in one of the year, this is 2004, Chinese embodied emission in exports. That means when you produce the export, the amount of the emissions you produce there, and actually we say is embodied in this trade products. It's 27% of the total Chinese emissions. And 1/3 of that goes to North America, US, Canada. Another 1/3 is triggered by our consumption in Western European countries, the traditional 9 Western European countries. Another 1/4 is triggered by Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So the developed countries, or the OECD developed countries, takes about 60 or 70% of the embodied emission from China. So we are the major contributors to have Chinese embodied emissions. That's 1 year. This is the cumulative figure from 1990s to 2008. It's about 18 years accumulations. During the 18 years, this much of the emissions being accumulated and mainly triggered by us, Western European countries, US and Japan as well. So similar story. So as I said, the developed countries is the major contributors to the embodied emission in terms of growth as well to Chinese emissions. This, I'm not going to scare you. You don't need to understand these figures, but I want you to pay attention to these red dots and these red dots, which on the left-hand side is Chinese embodied emission in the electronic sectors. The other one is the European electronic sectors. So the reason I'm popping this up is that I'll give you an example. There's many of you who I've seen several of you using iPhone, right? The production from Apple. So the iPhone 6, the production price for iPhone 6 is $178 US dollars. You possibly paid £500 to buy it, but the production price, factory price, was $178. And if you if you ever pay attention, on the back of the case, they have 2 lines. One is says made in China. The second line said designed in California. So that gives you the difference here. This is made in China. This is designed in California. Of course, this is a European one. So $178 for iPhone, $4 made by Chinese firm, including all the labor costs, environment costs, the resources, everything. And $130, about $130 made by the California Apple company and Cooper basically. And the rest of them, basically $30, $40, is international logistics. And so that tells you, when we in China, they talk about not say made in China, but say create in China. And create in China largely means moving to the upper stream of the supply chain, or it means switch to a high value-added industries. So electronic production is classified as highly value-added sectors. However, the current status still exists. Even in a high value-added sectors, you have a lower part of producers and a high end of the producers there. So that's the difference. When we talk about a policy to encourage or to put even subsidies to encourage such transformations, and it's not move from one sector for low end of the producers to another sector for low end producer. You really need to shift up to the supply chain, to the beginning of the side of the supply chain. So that's really is about. We say CO2 emissions exporting from China to the UK, to Europe, or to United States, but similarly within China it's still the same. So really, it's not the whole China producing for the world. Really, this is the 3 provinces on the coast. They are the world manufacturers. So there's but they are not only withdraw the resource by their own. They get support from rest of China, from the west, from north. So literally, the embodied emissions, or the emission goes like from economic lag behind regions to economic advanced regions. And the pre-processed products and resources goes to these 3 provinces. They further processing and make the products and go out to us and to the United States as well. That's for CO2 emission. But when we talk about the local pollutions, air pollutions is local pollutions. And it's still the same. It's similar stories. You possibly heard there's occasionally have a news headlines showing a smog issue in Beijing, and people run away, international firms run away because they couldn't bear of the quality of the air. Partially because of industrialization process, but largely export, producing for export is actually making the contribution for the air quality issue. So similar story, as I said, about 1/4 contributed by the North American, another 1/4 coming from the EU 27 countries. Similar story as CO2 emissions. But even local pollutants, they can create global impact. So one of the studies we published last year basically is showing that this is China. This is how bad the Chinese air quality is. But small amounts of the air pollution, they can physically disperse across the Pacific to the west coast of the US. They could cause, in theory, one smog day in Los Angeles because of the dispersion of the air pollutants. So CO2 emissions, when we talk of CO2 emissions, people don't care so much because it's a global pollutant. It becomes global pollutants, it becomes everyone's pollution. Everyone's pollution becomes nobody's pollution, really. So, but the air pollutant is different. They impact their health. And you breathe the, like say, a toxic air, and you get a consequence of your personal, physical, or mental health. And even a significant amount, or the majority of the amount of the pollutant stays in China, still a tiny, a little bit cross over the sea, the ocean, and then reach you, whether you care about that. So even I'm saying that the local pollutant would require the global effort to tackle it and then to minimize it, basically. Remember the race game I talk about, the race between GDP growth or consumption and technology. So they are racing. And who is going to win in the future? So we did some interesting, like say, in the academic we call scenario analysis. Basically, it's a game. So we say, let's tackle each of the sectors, each of the driver. So if every urban Chinese in the next 20 years, they earn the same amount as what US people earn right now. And they have the same lifestyles, drive big cars, eat McDonald's 3 times a day, almost, and see what's the impact. So what we call the Westernizing lifestyle. So if we have westernized lifestyle, and possibly people know this story, right? Super Size Me, and some of the possibly new student wouldn't know. There's if I remember him, it's Morgan Surplus, right? Yeah, he did a test, see how the McDonald's could destroy you. So he eats 3 times McDonald's per day, and he gained about 100 kilo roughly, and over 3-month period. And he basically shows you how bad to the health of the McDonald's. Basically, McDonald's not only no McDonald's representative here, right? But anyway, so basically the burgers, the cheeseburgers, or the beef burgers would do something to your heart, to your brain, and also they have a huge impact on the environment, both on the CO2 emissions and the water as well. So if we have westernized lifestyles, every urban Chinese, there's 1.3 billion Chinese there. Urban Chinese is half of them. If every urban Chinese has American lifestyles in the next 20 years, the Chinese CO2 emissions is gonna grow 3 times of the current right now. And basically, Chinese emissions is currently twice, almost twice of the size of the United States. It's the world largest right now. So if we grow another 3 times, so our effort to make climate change mitigation is just become useless. Let's talk about adaptation, how we gonna fight or how we gonna adapt the climate extreme events, not saying to mitigate or to reduce from them. But if we focus on the technology side, if we say we have best technologies, we have a CCS expert here who is also the co-author for the paper, and say the CCS basically represents as carbon capture and storage. What does that mean? So if you have a power plants and we have some clever technologies, we can capture, so we can get this CO2 emissions from before you emit from the chimney and liquidize it and then bury it under the ground. And David Rana from Cambridge, they did some of the surveys, possibly maybe reached some of you, saying that whether you are interested to have a liquidized CO2 emissions in your back garden, because we need to find a place to bury it, because whether it's down below the sea or under your back garden. I remember the results is majority of people would say, the CCS, the carbon capture storage technology, is very good, but not in my back garden. So. Anyway, so even say we find a way to where we bury it, and so we have the CCS technology, one of the best technology in the world to capture the CO2 emissions. This Chinese CO2 emissions is gonna still be similar to what we have right now, although it's still slightly much less than the reference or the business as a euro, but still similar as right now. That means China still not be able to commit any of the CO2 emission reduction in the near future. So, let's see, if China trying to reduce the commit some CO2 reduction commitment, like the Kyoto Protocol said, the Chinese energy will need to be about 40% powered by renewable energies. Renewable energy means, hydropower, solar, wind. The current renewable energy proportions in China is about 7 or 8%, but that needs a significant increase to 40%. And financially and technology perspective is not gonna happen in the near future. The above is really about the whole China, but China is a big country. It's a similar size, a little smaller than the EU 27. But basically, there's 30 provinces of that. It's full of inequalities within China. Economically, speaking, the east coast regions, they are more advanced, and the cities like Shanghai, Beijing, they are very much modern. There has no difference. Actually, to my opinion, it's much moderner than New York or even London. So basically, it's from infrastructure perspective, that's the case. From emission perspective, they are full of inequality as well. So the traditionally economically lag behind regions like Inner Mongolia and Ningxia, which is they are the highest. So they have the most per capita CO2 emissions. Why? They are not say they are very rich. A few dots or few cities in there, they are quite rich, but the overall they are still very lag behind. The reason for such high intensity because we discovered a good quality of coal in that area. So we just dig them out and burn it to generate electricity. And the electricity use that for aluminium processing, for example, which require huge amounts of electricity, and other type of processing. And those materials will go to other part of China for consumptions and or exports. When we look at those emissions within the regionals, there's always data issues. So I'm more like from an analyzed perspective. We need the data, and the quality of the data is the key for to produce good quality of research. So, but when we put the emissions for the regional 30 provinces, we discovered this huge issue about the data here. There was a paper in 2009. It's also published by our colleague Corinne Laquerie in UEA, and really it's saying that there's a huge uncertainty about climate change in the world. But one of the things we can be pretty sure is about how much fuels we burn globally, because they are controllable. You know it. How you make a record for that. So they give some estimates saying that there's uncertainty range for global fossil fuel emissions is 5%, roughly 5%. But when we look at the Chinese data, we are a bit shocked. Actually, we compared the two official published data sets in China. One is nationally published, the other is provincial. 30 provinces at the province level they published. The 30 provinces in China, when they aggregate together, when they add up together, they should be same, or at least similar to the national one. But actually, there's a huge gap here. The gap here is 1.4 gigatons. That possibly means nothing, but it's about 5% of global total. It's 20% difference between these two within the nation. So that is very, very shocking, actually. When you have a 20% of difference, you shouldn't call as a statistical error or like uncertainty. It's basically just an error. And we trying to, because China is the largest emitter in the world, and all the climate policy, nationally and internationally, relying on you have a solid baseline. So when you say you reduce 5% or like say 10%, whatever percentage, you need to apply it to a solid baseline. If you don't have, your numbers are wumbled like that, whatever you talk about, you can make it up. So eventually it's going to become a number crunching game if you don't have a solid baseline. Over the last few years, we published a paper very lately in August in Nature, received huge amounts of, this is just selective of the media interest, saying that Chinese emissions being overestimated. So that is our conclusion for the paper. Basically, it's this one. So collaborate with the Chinese colleagues and benefiting from one of the large projects of theirs. They actually surveyed almost 6,000 different coal mines in China, just one by one, collect samples from them, and classify the coal into 700 different categories. So when we have some of the aged people, you may burn the coal, you have some experience, you possibly think of there's not even sure you use a brown coal anyway. But anyway, there's possibly a few type of coals, but they classify them into 700 different type of coals. So then do these tests. So basically, we find this is the right one. It's based on this large surveyed data, and this is the emissions we have. And actually, they are 14% less than EDGAR database, 9% than a US database. Basically, these two databases are the kind of official database by using by the United States, the IPCC, for example. Why this is lower? Because there's poor regions in China. They burn poor, low quality coal. As I said, brown coal. Brown coal means they're not even black color. So they are actually half of them. They burnable, but half of them is just when you burn, it's just become a dust. They go to the air, and that's one of the reasons there's so bad air quality in China. So when they burn the low quality coals, there's not so much coal content there, not so much carbon content. It doesn't get so much heat what you want. Therefore, you burn so much of that rather than the good quality coals. That's really the statistics coming from. But this is actually draw international attention, as actually create some of the good like bargaining chips for the China in the Paris, because they're actually saying that actually we didn't emit that much. We can actually emit a little bit more, but it's not the case, because we have one overall aim to reduce CO2 emission to limit the 2 degrees C target, and the amount of we get, which a little bit lower, as good benefits. But China is still the world's largest CO2 emitter in the world. It's still about over 50% higher than the next one, the US, United States, the second largest emitters in the world. After we sort of figured out the emissions, then we come for the policies. We really see when China emissions can be peaked. So this is one of the big questions in Paris they are trying to ask. They're trying to ask you when when can you peak and how much you can peak. So we do some policy surveys for them. So we project the Chinese emissions, how they are gonna go forward in next 20 years, and this is what we got. So by business as usual, you need to emit so much, but with the Chinese emission peak, you need to reduce this much over the next 30 years. How you can reduce that? There's a 50% by improving technology and changing this economic structure. Another 30% by using low carbon fuels. In China term, natural gas is low carbon fuels, but here in the UK it's different. Low carbon fuels and renewable energies. But still there's about 20% left there. The 20%, China creating another market, a carbon trading market. It's traded like a stock exchange. You just buy the carbon, in simple term. And you buy the permit, in theory, and you use the permit to construct the renewables or carbon neutral products. So this is the sort of the way we can go forward. But it's still very challenging. It's not to say easy to do, but it's very challenging. China has been the world manufacturers over the last about 20 years now, 15 years at least. So when the Chinese economy goes up and people want to have a better environment a little bit, and the labor cost, as I said, you possibly heard one of the breaking news in China is China free the one-child policy. So the reason for that is the population. They need more laborers, especially the young laborers, and they need another baby booms, but it hasn't arrived. Anyway, so giving the cheap products produced by China is gonna be less and less. So the world economists would say, so where are we gonna get the cheap products from? So they propose these things, what they called post-China 16s. So they're saying that they're not gonna be one country produced for the world anymore. It's gonna be a bunch of countries produced for the world. So if that happens, there's going to be, from an environmental perspective, it's going to be very bad. The reason for that is that China, right now in China, there's about 20 years they learn how to produce for the world. There's a learning curve to achieve the efficiency you achieve right now. And if you move all the industries to India, to Vietnam, to Mexico, what else, there's Ethiopia, etc., people need time to gain the same efficiency. It may not take 15 or 20 years, but at least take 10 years or even more or even longer for the same efficiency level they do. But if you have, for example, if you move to India, you have a same or even worse energy structure. China burns 80% of Chinese energy was coal. Indian currently is 75%. But they're kicking off the industrialization process. They're gonna use more coal. They're gonna be more, coal-dominant economy. So if the things move to India, then there will be another emission giant in China, in the world. So after, let's say in Paris, we say China is gonna peak. And in the next 20 years, they're gonna see another, say India or Indonesia, is become another emission giant. Really, it's not the point of the global environment change or global environment change mitigations. We should aim for the global, not for the one single countries. As the Kyoto Protocol, my personal opinion, one of the mistakes they got is at that time, developed country was the major contributor to the world at that time in 1990s. Therefore, they put their head down, say, you sign this, and you're gonna reduce your emissions. But a few years later, China became the world largest emitter. Now in Paris, take them another big effort to make to make China to sign. Very likely, China is gonna sign something very firm to peak their emissions. And possibly in the next few years, you're going to get India, Indonesia to peak. So there's endless. It's going to be a cycle. So really, it's find one of the solution for that. What I said from let's put it economic in here, can be summarized what I called the triangular trade. So really, it's what is the international trade, or all the countries in the world, from the trade perspective, can be classified into three roles. And we got consumers, like in US and us, and we got producer like China, and also we got resource providers like Africa and Latin American countries. What's that flowing here? It's the environmental resources, emissions and environmental resources flowing between the countries here. The producers is connecting the consumers and resource providers to do these things. If this is the triangular trade right now, but if we are all familiar, maybe many of you are familiar with 400 years ago, we have this slavery trade, Atlantic slavery trade, what they called. And at that time was Britain, get the resources from North American countries, and then process them and then shipped to the Africa, and like ram, wines, or the cotton products, etc., exchange for slaves, and slaves go back to North America to engage with agriculture and some preliminary processing products. This is what we called slavery, Atlantic slavery trade. And 400 years ago, at that time, what is flowing right now? At that time was free labor. But if you think about right now, it's labor. We don't need free labor anymore. And it's almost free resources. So the whole flowing patterns hasn't been changed. Only thing changed is a factor of production. So basically, what's the most important for economic production? At that time was labor, and there's other, right now it's resources. If we use this climate change as a, reflect to the slavery trade, it took the whole human race 200 years to get over this slavery trade. And actually, but in the end, there was a very strong agreement and a very strong policy. Even the Britain sent the battleship, in the seas, and to minimize the trade and to get rid of it. Whether we have such a strong policy, or at least a willingness in the world to have this. But on the other hand, some of the economists will say, okay, the slavery trade actually is not because of policy. It's, there's a famous book called Capitalism of the Slavery Trade, basically saying that we had the industrialization. We don't need labor anymore. So let's do them a favor to free them, because we can see there's a machinery is going to replace the labor by then. But if you link it with the climate change, whether we do a favor for we are going to do a favor for the CO2 emissions. Possibly when the wind powers and solar powers, when the technology become cheaper, then you need to, let's say, then do them a favor. Let's sign a global agreement to do that. But is it too late? What's this? What's the the implications for this? Okay, so lots of few notes. Basically, I talked so much, everything else, but to summarize, there's regional cooperations, both within the country or across the countries, is a powerful force in the global economy, but not really in the climate change mitigation field. Consumption emission mitigation, potential distributed emission mitigation, reduction responsibilities, but they're not sufficient right now. There's no economic mechanisms to tackle the emission reduction. Such a mechanism should be designed and should be care about what we call distributional effect, which really to care for the poor, care for the low income populations. Whether emission peak in China is a good idea, to me, it's not. Really, I think from the global perspective, we should, the efficiency, on one hand, the producer should increase the efficiency. On the other hand, as a consumer, we all are, as a global way, we should lead to a more sustainable consumption manner to become a fashion, because the 1.3 billion Chinese and the 1.2 billion Indians, they are trying to learning our lifestyles. They see our lifestyle as a fashion or is the way forward. And we need to change it. Not say UK reduce 80% of CO2 emission. It doesn't do much to the global climate change, simply because we are too small. But if we lead the fashion to a sustainable consumption, that could do a lot more to developing country populations where there's about 40% of the global population there. I think I have my lecture here, and thank you very much.